Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan, and we are broadcasting from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. This summer, we'll be refreshing the schedule on our all-news and public affairs channel, The Source. That's 88.5 HD3. So I'd like your feedback on the shows we're about to hear. If you'd like to listen to The Source, you can listen on an HD radio at 88.5 HD3. You can listen on WMNF.org or on the WMNF app. So here's how you can give feedback about the show we're about to hear. You can email DJ at WMNF.org. You can text 813-433-0885. We're going to listen now to the latest episode of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and you can hear it every Friday morning at 9 on HD3 WMNF. This episode is about industrial hemp and about plastics, so let me know what you think.
This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Skrovan, and along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning, Steve.
And Ralph Nader, the man of the hour. Hello, Ralph.
Thank you. We have an interesting program where we have the silent violence of the plastic industry described and a potential substitute industry on the rise.
Our first guest today, Shannon Osaka, reports on climate for the Washington Post. Her latest article, entitled "The Plastics We Breathe," reveals that every breath we take might be chock full of microplastics, tiny particles that come in many different shapes and are invisible to the naked eye. Mostly, researchers say, these tiny fibers float into the air when they slough off nylon or polyester clothes. Other microplastics come off of car tires, plastic packaging, AstroTurf, or are an ingredient in cosmetic exfoliating agents. According to Ms. Osaka, they are suspended in the air on city streets and inside homes. One study found that people inhale or ingest, on average, 74,000 to 121,000 microplastic particles per year through breathing, eating, and drinking. How might they affect our health? And how do we get them out of the very air we breathe? Our second guest may have part of the answer to that question. Regular listeners may recall that a little over 3 years ago, we interviewed filmmaker Michael Henning. He had done a documentary entitled "Hempsters Plant the Seed," about the struggle to legalize industrial hemp, which is an incredibly versatile product that has nothing to do with marijuana. Can't get you high. Lo and behold, about 7 months after that interview, Congress passed legislation that legalized the cultivation of industrial hemp. Even someone like Mitch McConnell was on board. Problem then was about how to scale up the infrastructure, mainly manufacturing the special machinery that harvests hemp. Among many other uses, the cellulose from hemp stems can be a substitute for plastic, with the advantage of it being 100% biodegradable. We'll get an update from Mr. Henning on how that is all progressing in the 2.5 years since the law went into effect. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not moving as quickly as we thought. And it's not hard to guess what corporate interests are slowing things down. As usual, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our stalwart corporate crime reporter, Rosa Mokhyber. But first, when Sting wrote, "Every breath you take," I doubt he was thinking of microplastics. David?
Shannon Osaka is a climate reporter covering policy, culture, and science for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, she was a climate reporter at the nonprofit environmental outlet Grist. Her latest is called "The Plastics We Breathe," which appeared in the June 10th edition of the Washington Post. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Shannon Osaka.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, listeners, you've heard a lot of stories that have alarmed you on our program over the years. And, you're preoccupied and busy, and some of them you probably felt don't really relate to you. This not only relates to you, but it's inside of you. As Shannon reported in the first paragraph of her lengthy article, these microplastics are suspended in the air on city streets and inside homes. One study found that people inhale or ingest an average 74,000 to 124,000 microplastic particles per year through breathing, eating, and drinking, end quote. Well, it was DuPont and other chemists that developed plastics earlier in the 20th century, and they ballyhooed a valhalla of successful uses and, of course, didn't mention the dark, deadly side. So can you start explaining to our listeners about the more recent discoveries due to better detection technologies that have proven the entry of these particles in all kinds of products we buy and in every organ in our body?
Yeah, absolutely. I think originally scientists were thinking of microplastics as something that was in the ocean. They were affecting fish, they were affecting mussels and things like that. And they were looking at microplastics that you might find in cosmetics. So like those tiny beads that can exfoliate your face or things like that. That was where the concern started. And then as scientists started to develop better technologies, like better forms of spectroscopy, they started looking smaller and smaller, and they started finding these particles everywhere. They started finding them in our tap water. They started finding them in bottled water, in vegetables, in fruits, in the food that we eat. They started finding them in samples in just the air around us in our homes. And more recently, they've started looking into organs themselves, and they have found microplastics in most of our major organs. So in the liver, in the kidneys, in the placenta of pregnant women. And so microplastics are not only around us, they are also inside us, as you said.
And what are they starting to see in terms of damage to the human body?
This is a really difficult problem, and it's partly because there is no one microplastic. Microplastics are made of a whole bunch of different materials. They're made with different chemical additives. And so scientists have found that microplastics can have certain effects in the laboratory. They can cause cell death, they can cause tissue damage, they can cause allergic reactions. They are starting to put the pieces together on the impact on human health. So people, looking at larger scale studies of people who have been found more likely to suffer heart attack if they have microplastics in particular arteries, more likely to have inflammatory bowel disease if they have microplastics in their feces. But it's still, scientists kind of tell me that they're still piecing it together. We don't have quite a full picture of what the health impacts are yet.
Well, in your article, you say of the more than 10,000 chemicals used in the manufacture of plastic, scientists have identified over 2,400 of them as potentially toxic. And the growth in 1950, the world produced 2 million metric tons of plastic every year. Last year, it was over 400 million metric plastics. To get down to what people buy with plastic containers, explain what single-use plastic containers are that people, when they go buy in the supermarket or other stores, they don't say, well, this is a single-use plastic container.
Right. So single-use are basically those thinner pieces of plastic that only hold up essentially for one use. So you might think of plastic cups, plastic covers that go on a coffee cup, plastic bags that you get at the grocery store, plastic straws. Those make up a huge proportion of the plastic that we use, and we use them so briefly. I mean, if you think about the plastic that you might have in your headphones or in your computer or something like that, that lasts a long time. But these single-use plastics are very brief, and then we throw them out. And the thing about plastic is that it doesn't really go away. It doesn't really break down. It really breaks up into these tinier and tinier pieces when it's exposed to wind, when it's exposed to UV light. And that's how we get these microplastics that slew off these pieces of plastic and then get into our air, into the soil, into our bodies.
Like if you use a plastic cup to drink water every day, say when you wake up and you're in the bathroom, that is flaking off microparticles every time you pick it up?
Yes. So scientists that I've talked to say that it's a bit like your skin. I mean, when we think about our skin is kind of shedding, little pieces and flakes all the time, which is a bit gross to think about. But plastics are doing the same thing. When you have a cup with water in it, some of that plastic is slewing off into the water that you're drinking. Some of it may be slewing off kind of against your hand into the air. That's happening all the time. And some of those microplastics go into the body and we might cough them up or breathe them out. but some of them, if they're small enough, can go deeper and deeper into the body and get into our organs.
And what does this say about bottled water? People often, they can afford it, buy bottled water, which almost entirely comes in hard plastic bottles, so they can avoid some of the things that get into public drinking water systems through their faucet. What does it say now in terms of the balance of safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think bottled water is very risky at this point. There was a study from researchers who found that there are 100 to 1,000 times more microplastic particles in bottled water than they had previously thought. And that's because they started looking for these tinier pieces, for these nanoplastic particles, and they found that there were tons of them in bottled water. So there is likely much more microplastic in bottled water than in tap water. And when you are drinking that water, you are drinking in that plastic.
And have the public drinking water systems around the country recognized what you just said?
So there is a little bit of effort in California where they're trying to track the microplastics in their tap water, at least to get a baseline and then determine how possible it is to regulate it. Microplastics can be filtered out of tap water, but not all of them are filtered out. Some of them are just too small. They're making it through the filtration process and into our bodies. And so far, to my knowledge, it's just California that has started this process of looking into first counting the microplastics and maybe in the future regulating them. So, I think that in some ways we are behind in terms of how we're regulating this.
Well, reading your article in the Washington Post, we're talking with Shannon Osaka, who was co-author of the article with Simon Ducroquette. It comes across as a massive global assault, hour by hour, a silent, violent epidemic or pandemic. When you look at the fact that it's everywhere, it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in human bodies, it's in the animals that are eaten, it's in the pipes, it's being swallowed regularly, it's invisible, it doesn't produce immediate pain, it's in the placenta, the liver, the breast milk, as you said. Are you concerned that people are just going to sort of say, this blows our mind, we just can't get a hold of it? Or is something happening in Congress, the Environmental Protection Agency doing anything to start reducing year after year the use of plastic?
There are some interesting bills that have been proposed in Congress. I don't know how far they're going to get. I don't think it's been a huge priority for a lot of lawmakers. The only way to kind of get our arms around this, I think, is to start instituting restrictions on the production of plastic. And right now, there is a process to create an international treaty and many countries are pushing for there to be voluntary limitations. So something kind of like the Paris Agreement for climate change, where countries agree we're going to phase down the use of fossil fuels. Similarly, some countries are saying we need to phase down the production of plastic. The U.S. has historically not supported a push to phase down production. They've called for things more like advanced chemical recycling and things like that, which have been proven by many scientists to not be effective. So I think there is some push, but for the individual person, it's terrifying because you see plastic everywhere in your life. It's very hard to avoid, and avoiding it requires you to do all of these sort of complicated things around how you buy things, going to bulk stores, et cetera. And so I think we really need more push, and scientists who are looking at the health impacts of this are really hoping that their work is making it into Congress and is pushing policymakers to make a difference.
Well, listeners should know, as of now, there are no U.S. laws or regulations governing microplastics in the air or in food, as Shannon pointed out. Also, she reported researchers warn there aren't yet studies showing a strong causal link between microplastics and a particular disease, end quote. But that's largely because the research is just beginning in the area. You referenced a study in Italy, which did find that people who have microplastics in the lining of their arteries are more likely to suffer heart attack, stroke, or death from any cause. And another report you cite that people with inflammatory bowel diseases had higher concentrations of microplastics in their feces. So the research is just getting underway after the new detection technology brought the evidence of this microplastic pandemic to public attention. But I would think the glass industry, the paper industry, paper bag industry, for example, and the industrial hemp industry would see an opening here to provide containers for retail and containers for other uses in the economy that are now using plastics, and now they can use these other substitute materials. Anything on that horizon, competition?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't heard of very much push from those industries in terms of pointing out the harms of microplastics, but it's definitely something I'm interested in looking into more. There's been a lot of push for sort of more biodegradable plastics and things like that, but there are a lot of questions about those products and just how biodegradable are they? Sometimes they need to be degraded in a particular type of facility in order for them to fully degrade. And all of that, just adds on additional costs. And a lot of companies, it seems, are just not willing to take on that cost of doing different types of packaging that isn't plastic. So, yeah, that's something that I'm interested in looking into more.
Well, there's an interesting story, I believe, in the Washington Post recently. There's a store that opened up that engages in bulk supplies. So you go in there without any plastic containers, and there are no plastic containers in the store, and you basically take what you need from the bulk supply and put it in your own non-plastic container and take it home. So we'll see how that retail competition begins to evolve. When you did your story, I'm sure you called up some of the chemical companies producing the plastics. They don't seem to be too willing to talk about it. They weren't much quoted in your lengthy article. What was your experience there?
Yeah, I spoke to the American Chemistry Council, which is, a group a trade organization around plastics. And they emphasize that they are also looking into this topic. They are also, they've committed some money, $15 million, to research into microplastics. They tend to be cautious about the results from academic scientists and say that we need more sort of uniform techniques and methods in order to detect microplastics. So, I think they were hesitant to say sort of much on the topic and continue to say that we need more research to show health effects, if any.
Name some of the major manufacturers of these plastics.
Well, it's interesting because major plastic manufacturers are also, in a large part, they're connected to the fossil fuel industry because plastics are made from petrochemicals. And so the fossil fuel industry sees an opening, even as we're talking about phasing out fossil fuels, to develop their business by expanding the petrochemical side of the business. So, it's some of those same actors and some of the larger chemical companies that we're familiar with.
We're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour on WMNF Tampa. This is Tuesday Cafe.
I remember the famous environmental scientist Barry Commoner, who taught at Washington University in St. Louis and then later in Queens College in New York City, once told me he was thinking of writing a book urging the abolition of the entire petrochemical industry. And I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Wait until you see what comes out in the coming years." He was very prophetic. Barry Commoner has written a couple of great books on the environment. Shannon, at the end of your article, you quote Professor Sherry Mason, who's a scientist at Penn State, with a rather ominous forecast. She said, quote, "By the time we have that full answer, we'll have already impacted human health. It'll be too little, too late," end quote. Well, we've got to have a much more aggressive attention span in our country to these microplastics. And once you show the graphic evidence, you shouldn't have too many difficulties in making people, particularly people with children and grandchildren, interested in having something done about it. Like so many of these devastating environmental impacts, we do have a lot of substitutes, a lot of solutions on the shelf that need to be put into practice on the ground. And it can start with all of us simply reducing our level of single-use plastic containers. Steve?
Shannon, you've obviously done a deep dive into this. I just want to ask on a personal level, what do you do now? Have you changed your consumption, your lifestyle? This may be instructive to our listeners as to what steps you have taken, somebody who knows all about this now.
Yeah, it definitely scared me as soon as I started looking into this. And I was trying to avoid plastic before, but I think it's definitely kicked things into a higher gear for me. So I usually tell people the easiest thing is just start with those single-use plastic items. Start by saying, I'm not going to use, one of those coffee top containers. I'm not going to use a plastic cup. I'm not going to use plastic water bottles or straws or single-use bags. I mean, that can cut out a lot of things. I avoid heating food in the microwave in plastic. That has been shown to accelerate the rate at which these microplastics can spill out into your food. That's definitely not what you want. And now when I microwave things, if I were to microwave something in plastic, I would be envisioning those microplastics just entering into my body. But I think about it as, start with the easiest thing, start with those single-use plastics, and then advance from there, trying to remove, plastics that you might use a few times. So maybe like plastic takeout containers and things like that. Bringing your own containers to a restaurant with you if you think you're going to have takeout. They're usually very happy to accommodate that. And then you can sort of ramp it up from there with whatever you feel able to do. Not everyone has the same capabilities in terms of how the means that they have to tackle this problem, but there's definitely places to start for everyone. And I avoid plastic water bottles entirely.
David?
Right now, we're hearing the right wing talk about carbon capture instead of getting off fossil fuels. So where are we right now with the right or the medical community, snake oil salesmen, convincing us they have something that can leach out these nanoplastics already in your body? There's no way to remove them, correct?
Not that we know of, and we still have such little understanding of how long they are really staying in there. We've seen them in organs, but when did they get there? All of that tracking, scientists are still working on. I think that when people talk about advanced recycling or chemical recycling, that is an example of where it's really just part of the same status quo of let's produce more plastic. We can promise you that we have a way to get rid of it. We haven't seen advanced recycling scale to the point where people had hoped that it would scale. And so it's hard to see, kind of similar with carbon capture, it's hard to imagine that we are going to capture all of the carbon that we're currently using in an efficient, cost-effective manner. It's hard to imagine that we're going to do that with chemical recycling as well. There has to be some limitation on the plastic that we're putting into the environment.
Anna?
Shannon, for campaigns to change consumer habits and industry habits around things like plastics that have horrible environmental impacts and then also horrible health impacts, it seems like it's pretty handy to have a really visceral, vivid public image. I'm thinking about the sea turtle with a straw up its nose, and all of a sudden everyone was horrified about plastic straws, and that became this kind of iconic image to rally around. I imagine it's hard to see microplastics up a sea turtle's nose. So is there a kind of iconic PSA image you can think of? Or if there isn't one, what would you like to see as an emblematic image to rally around?
That's such an interesting question. And yeah, I think the challenge with micro and nanoplastics is, this fact that they're microscopic. You can't, it would be great if we had an image of kind of the human lung with microplastics in it, but we can't literally see those. I would sort of hope that down the line, as our techniques get better, scientists will be able to create better visualizations for us that are just showing where they are embedded in our organs, and that could help people understand. But I also think that perhaps it's just there hasn't been enough attention to this issue yet, because we've seen really compelling visualizations around smoking and things like that. And as the science develops, I think we'll see more push in this direction.
We've been speaking with Washington Post reporter Shannon Osaka, who was the prime author of a very lengthy article in June 10th, 2024 edition of the Washington Post on microplastics and what is known thus far and what needs to be known with further research and regulation. Final two questions, Shannon. Would you like to write a book on this? I'm sure you've done a lot more research than can be fitted even in a full page in the Washington Post. And second, maybe our readers would like to find out more what the substitute competition is thinking and doing. The glass industry, for example, the paper industry, for example, and the upcoming industrial hemp industry to replace uses of plastic across the board.
Yeah, I have definitely thought about a possible book. I think I'd like the science to be a little bit more developed, but you always have to trade off how much you know versus kind of being one of the early folks to write about it. And yeah, I think I definitely will look more into the alternatives. And I think for your listeners who are thinking about how to adjust their lifestyles, looking for local bulk stores, looking to avoid single-use plastics, these are all great places to start. And there's, lots of good people online who try to live plastic-free lives, and it can be very exciting to see all the things that they've done. And so I would look in that direction as well.
Well, that's very encouraging. We look forward to your further work in the Washington Post on this critical subject. Thank you very much, Shannon Osaka.
Thanks so much for having me.
We've been speaking with Shannon Osaka. We will link to her interactive article at the Washington Post, The Plastics We Breathe, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, industrial hemp was a valuable crop at the founding of the country. It fell out of favor for all the wrong reasons. When we come back, we'll find out if hemp has been able to make its own comeback. But first, let's hear from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Take it away, Russell.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 5, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The U.S. Supreme Court last week rejected one of the primary ways the Securities and Exchange Commission enforces rules against securities fraud, likely also making it harder for other regulatory agencies to bring enforcement actions. That's according to a report in the New York Times. The SEC, like other regulators, sometimes enforces its regulations and imposes penalties using in-house tribunals without juries rather than federal courts. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for a 6-justice conservative majority, said that practice violated the Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial. A defendant facing a fraud suit has the right to be tried by a jury of his peers before a neutral adjudicator, the Chief Justice wrote. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah Feldman, and Ralph. A law legalizing the cultivation of industrial hemp passed on January 1st, 2022. Our next guest is going to tell us whether the industry has been able to take advantage of that. David?
Michael Henning is a filmmaker, public speaker, and longtime proponent of the industrial hemp movement. He is the director of Hempsters, Plant the Seeds, a documentary about the struggle to legalize industrial hemp. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Michael Henning.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Welcome back. For those who don't know much about industrial hemp, it is not marijuana. It has a THC of under 1/3 of 1%. It's a long, natural fiber that was used by the ancient Chinese thousands of years ago for many, many products. Over the years, it's been used as food, clothing, upholstery. The auto companies even now use some of it for inside your motor vehicle. It's been used for lubricants. It just has hundreds of potential users. But it's been banned for years in the United States, since World War II years. And even though the Navy was making the best kind of rope from industrial hemp, very strong fiber, it can be grown in all kinds of areas with minimal water and minimal chemical applications. But our farmers were banned. But paradoxically, we allowed imports from France, Canada, Romania, China, until 2018, when Congress acted to legalize the growth of industrial hemp by American farmers. And in our prior interview with Michael, we look forward to a rapid expansion of industrial hemp because it's so degradable, recyclable. It's a great substitute for many petrochemical products and other uses that have damaging environmental effects. But it has not happened. We're still importing it from Canada, but the acreage is devoted in the U.S. is minimal, and we want Michael to explain concisely why, with farmers able to grow it and supposedly considerable demand, including for hemp food, which is very nutritious, this industry is still a very tiny one with less than 10, 15,000 acres grown in the United States. Can you explain?
Yes. The issue is the fact that the farmers are being prohibited from growing this crop by regulations. The main regulation is the fact that they cannot grow it unless its rating is 0.3. That's 0.3 THC. So what happens is that they grow a crop, and like there's one instance here in Texas where they grew a crop. I know of this farmer, and his crop was 800 acres, and the rating on his THC level in the crop was 0.5 instead of 0.3. Remember the zero here, 0%, 0.5. And they had no lenience at all, and he had to burn his 800 acres of his hemp crop. The irony of all this is that, in some states where the states have allowed marijuana to be grown for smokable, they have, they're growing it for 30%, and yet they're prohibiting the hemp farmer from going over 0.3. It's an obvious ploy to make the farmers lose interest. They're not going to keep doing this if they, can't grow a crop with the lenience that they're giving to the smokable group. And what happens is that they have, they're taking a chance, they're making an investment, and then they're being told that they have to destroy their crop. The public and the farmers and everyone involved in this should be outraged. They should be diligent in saying, why are we even debating something that's zero? You can't sell it to the pot smokers. They're not going to be remotely interested. Even if it's 5% or 10%, it won't have any bearing on them making a crop that can be sold for smokable.
What's the name of this regulatory agency that you're complaining properly about, and what's their motive?
Well, I think it's the Department of Agriculture, and who's behind it, I don't know. We can only guess. But their motive, I think, is to put the genie back in the bottle. It might be the Drug Enforcement Agency that's actually the most active in doing that. They're the ones who enforce that law.
And what's their motive?
To put the genie back in the bottle, to make it to the point where the farmers are having so much trouble growing the crop that they just walk away from it.
But what's the corporate commercial interest outside the DEA and Department of Agriculture that's making these agencies try to stifle farmers from producing?
Perhaps it's the petroleum companies, because they're the ones that would be in competition with what the hemp could do, especially when it comes to plastics.
Or you're saying perhaps. You live in Texas, don't you?
Yep.
Okay, there's no perhaps. You either know it or you don't, because our listeners are entitled after years of my boosting industrial hemp and all the various consumer products it can produce and how environmentally benign it is and how it's a way to fight climate, global warming, disruption. And now, after several years, it's been crushed. And you say perhaps? Now, give it to me straight, Michael. You're a documentary maker. Documentary makers don't use the word perhaps.
Yeah, we've all been kind of trained to tiptoe around the subject, but it has to be the petroleum company, because they're the only ones who have a vested interest that would be threatened by the incoming usage of hemp. There is also, back in the time of William Randolph Hearst, people speculated that he was involved because of hemp for paper, but I think that the main thing is plastic and petroleum is what's glaringly the culprit.
Okay, we've nailed that down. Now, are the remnants of the farming community that's still growing a few thousand acres totally in the United States, far less in Canada, are they moving up to Congress to get something done? Who's lobbying on the side of this wonderful long fiber that's been used for thousands of years?
Well, that's been my whole message all along. They're using the perhaps where you're pointing out that shouldn't be used. They should be livid. They should be furious. They're being told to do that. But we're talking about the groups that are the agricultural groups in each state, and they're begging Congress to give them the right to grow it at 0.5. I mean, that's a joke. And you couldn't even get high on 5% THC in the crop. There should be no limitations at all. I'll tell you what I did, Ralph. I called the Department of Agriculture and just said, yeah, I'd like to know how much it would cost me to buy a permit for growing cotton and corn. And they said, "Oh, sir, that's your God-given right. You can grow it. You can grow anything you want. You don't have to have a permit or pay any fee." And I said, "Well, what about hemp?" And they came unglued. They're like, "Well, who are you?" And I said, I'm a documentary filmmaker. And they admitted that putting a permit purchase on hemp farming, but not on corn, not on cotton, it's so obviously picked for some powers that be that are trying to shut it down. And I can only tell you that the petroleum industry is the only one that is remotely threatened by their appearance. And they're begging Congress for, just give us a little more. They should be saying, the whole thing's a joke.
Has there been a hearing in Congress on this?
No.
This is the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and we're listening on WMNF Tampa Tuesday Cafe.
We're importing hemp from Canada and France and other countries. Do they meet the 0.3 standard?
Yes, but
why can't American farmers meet it?
Well, I don't know the workings of why they can't meet it, but if you're a new farmer to hemp, like it's just being introduced in Texas, the fact that there would be no leniency at all, 0.3, and then a farmer grows 800 acres, it's 0.5, and they say burn the crop, that's so heavy-handed, it's hard to believe, you know, and those countries are way ahead of us. There might be some pressure being put on from their side.
Well, in an article I saw recently, there was a peak of 37,000 acres with industrial hemp growth in 2020, and it's been all downhill since that. Well, there are two categories of industrial hemp, the ones that are fiber, and then there are ones called hemp flowers. Tell us the difference.
Well, it's grown differently, but the concept of hemp flowers means the buds at the top of the plants that are used for CBD and other, ingestible oil for human consumption. I personally think that that's kind of a waste of time. It's a nice thing. I've tried some CBD products. Many people say that they don't notice any difference. What's really important, the one that could make all the difference, is the fiber crop that they grow. It grows like bamboo, and they could harvest this and turn it into hemp plastic, which melts in the ocean. It has a 6-month regular when it's put into a garbage dump, for example. In 6 months, it will be gone. It goes right back to nature. But the big ocean harvest, I guess you'd say, of the petroleum plastics is massive, and problem solved. Yes, but
why can't American farmers meet it?
Well, I don't know the workings of why they can't meet it, but if you're a new farmer to hemp, like it's just being introduced in Texas, the fact that there would be no leniency at all, 0.3, and then a farmer grows 800 acres, it's 0.5, and they say burn the crop, that's so heavy-handed, it's hard to believe, you know, and those countries are way ahead of us. There might be some pressure being put on from their side.
Well, in an article I saw recently, there was a peak of 37,000 acres with industrial hemp growth in 2020, and it's been all downhill since that. Well, there are two categories of industrial hemp, the ones that are fiber, and then there are ones called hemp flowers. Tell us the difference. Well,
it's grown differently, but the concept of hemp flowers means the buds at the top of the plants that are used for CBD and other, ingestible oil for human consumption. I personally think that that's kind of a waste of time. It's a nice thing. I've tried some CBD products. Many people say that they don't notice any difference. What's really important, the one that could make all the difference, is the fiber crop that they grow. It grows like bamboo, and they could harvest this and turn it into hemp plastic, which melts in the ocean. It has a 6-month regular when it's put into a garbage dump, for example. In 6 months, it will be gone. It goes right back to nature. But the big ocean harvest, I guess you'd say, of the petroleum plastics is massive, and problem solved. All we have to do is implement hemp plastic, and the problem is over. And you never hear about it. I've listened to show after show, and I've never heard him bring up that solution. That's what's so important about your show. It should probably be the only one out there that's promoting this if we can get the word far and wide.
So you think industrial hemp could replace a lot of plastic? Give me some examples.
You name it. Any plastic product that you see in the world can be made from hemp plastic. And it's just getting started. There's not enough back industry to support it on a mass scale, but it's getting there. And if people demanded it, the public demanded it, it could happen overnight. But not many people get this information. But I hear so many people complaining about the plastic in the ocean and the environmental havoc it's creating. But we have the full solution right now, started tomorrow.
So here you have the oil, gas, coal industry omnicidally producing climate catastrophes by the day Mega hurricanes are linked to it. Droughts are linked to it. Rising sea levels are linked to it. Wildfires they've never seen in history are linked to it. Tornadoes and frequency and ferocity linked to the fossil fuel industry. Now they have another arm of their omnicidal. They're now trying to crush the way to replace these omnicidal products that are being burned and creating a burning planet, in effect. So
Yes.
are there no champions in Congress? Not even the progressive wing in Congress? Name some names that we can have our listeners connect with.
Well, there's Paul Benham. He's from Australia, but he's at least going at it with everything he's got. He has a company called Hemp Plastic Company. It's really a, how can I put it? It looks like a real coup that's working on the side of the bad guys. If I had it my way, you need some people that will just go in there and not try to make a compromise. Say, I'm madder than hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. That kind of a attitude needs to be lobbied against the powers that be, and I don't see it.
We're talking with Michael P. Henning, who has consistently been an advocate for all the uses, degradable and renewable, of industrial hemp and freeing the American farmer to grow it, and producer of the Signal documentary on this called Hempsters Plant the Seed, which has received rave reviews from viewers and critics alike. Let's look at the media. You have the progressive media, Nation Magazine, Indies Times, Progressive Magazine out of Wisconsin, Washington Monthly. They don't censor themselves by the oil, gas, and coal industry. Two questions. Have they written on it? Have you given them materials to whet their appetite? And what about the mass media? 60 Minutes is often cited as brave media, the New York Times and Post. What's the story?
Well, we're working on 60 Minutes, but what we've decided to do, J.C. Merckx is my PR guy and manager in terms of this film project, and we've decided to make another film. I wasn't going to do it. I said, I made the first one. It says all it needs to say, but we're working on a new project now called Hempsters Reap the Harvest. It's going to address this exact issue. And if we can get that out and show the incredible corruption that's involved, it goes deeper than that, Ralph. Something that you should know about this, just incredibly shocking about all this, is that Chinese farmers are being brought over here, and they're hiring people who get through the borders to work in their marijuana fields, and they own the land. They come in, they're buying American farmland, huge amounts, and guarding it with Chinese military. These are facts, and I can prove them to you. And just to maintain their advantage of growing marijuana and hemp, it really shouldn't be called marijuana anymore. You should never use that word. That's what they put on us to demonize the plant. They're cannabis farming. They're buying huge, massive amounts of land all over the United States, and they're putting their workers in that are illegal Chinese immigrants. And what the hell is wrong with this government that would allow foreign countries, especially China, come in and buy farmland and grow hemp? It's insane.
Let's get back to the media here. Have you called these reporters? We've had on this program Shannon Osaka, who's done the definitive feature in the Washington Post on the deadly spread of microplastics in everybody's body, in the water and soil and food. You should contact her and interest her in a sequel on a substitute product called industrial hemp. Now, the hemp we're getting from Canada, is that mostly hemp food that's sold in certain food stores around the country?
I know Canada is diversified into every facet of the industry, and there's so many. I mean, they do hempcrete, replacement for concrete. Canada is a shining example of what we should be doing by now. But they were 15 years ahead of us before they even allowed the thought of growing hemp here in America, which the history is unbelievable. I mean, we used to be growing it in mass quantities, and the story of how it got shut down is outrageous. And that's what we're going to try to put into this next documentary that goes into the history of how this all took place. But it's vested interest and it's corruption at the highest level. And there's no other way around it. Even today that I would have to get a permit to grow hemp, but I don't have to do that for wheat or for cotton. You don't need any permit. If you're a farmer, you can farm it. They told me my God-given right to do that. That sounds like our line, God-given.
Well, what's your website, by the way, before we go to Steve and the questions?
Hempstersthemovie.com.
Steve?
Michael, what's the role of local law enforcement? Because they get a lot of money from the federal government to deal with drugs. Is that another pressure against dealing with industrial hemp?
Yes, absolutely. And if you can find a scene in the movie where Craig Lee speaks out about it, he gives the kind of rant that should be coming from everywhere. But he says, to quote him, he says, "The DEA ain't worth a damn," and Craig Lee said it. They had shipped into Kentucky from Canada horse bedding, and they found 14 parts per million of THC. This isn't percentages, parts per million. And they said to Craig and his group that was trying to start some legitimate business with horse bedding that he had to send it back. And in the film, he says, if they catch a cocaine dealer bringing in drugs, they don't tell them to send it back. They confiscate it. So what's the deal here, he says. This is a Kentucky farmer, and they got on him about 14 parts per million THC in horse bedding and shut him down because of the expense it costs to send it all back. And he says it's the DEA. He said, there's one entity that I can't vote for, and it's the DEA. The DEA is the most profitable hemp farmers in the world. They get $1 million per acre. Here's the irony of all this. They're cutting down feral ditchweed. And if you go to the DEA's website, it's right there. It's called the Cannabis Eradication Program. Well, why the hell are they eradicating cannabis when it's illegal to grow in all 50 states? They're taking us to the cleaners for the amount of money that taxpayers pay support the Cannabis Eradication Program. How can you have a Cannabis Eradication Program when it's illegal to grow in all 50 states? Nobody's saying anything about this. It's right there in the front of their webpage.
It seems to me that the old guard at the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and at the Department of Agriculture, which we've called the Department of Agribusiness, is still trying to snuff out industrial hemp and circumvent congressional intent. In 2018, the doors were supposed to be open by Congress. And it was also a very prominent role by right-wing libertarian Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. Kentucky farmers were demanding to be able to grow industrial hemp. So Congress should be pretty outraged at having its clear road ahead for industrial hemp obstructed by corporate-backed bureaucratic log jams.
It's right there on their web. You go to the Drug Enforcement Agency's webpage. Right up front, it talks about the Federal Eradication Program against cannabis. What the hell? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. It reeks with corruption, and we're going to make another film about that and hopefully get it out there to the public. But it's outrageous.
Hannah?
If we've learned anything from the auto safety movement's push to get seatbelts in cars, it's that big, important issues can make for unlikely bedfellows. Are there any allies you've found in the fight for the industrial hemp movement?
Woody Harrelson, Craig Lee, the Kentucky farmer, Joe Hickey, another Kentucky advocate. These guys have been involved since day one. They slugged it out to the point where it finally became legal, and the DEA still driving around harvesting feral ditchweeds to make millions and millions of dollars. And where does that money go? That's something that they go to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and took their crop. We got it on camera. I didn't know I was filming a crime at the time. But enforcement agencies are not allowed to be, treaty abrogation. And they go in, they just say, look, the 1973 Controlled Substance Act trumps tribal sovereignty. It does. It's just, sometimes it's beyond words. I'm so shook up by it that I can't find the exact words. Just I have to hold back profanity. But I don't tell you exactly how I feel.
Well, we've got to get more candidates talking it up in the election year. I remember in 1996 and 2000 when I was running for president, I would talk about it a great deal. Industrial hemp can produce so many thousands of different products and be very kind to the earth and to our posterity. And, of course, that's why it's a candidate for suppression. And like big corporations do all the time, they go to the government to do the dirty work for them. So try to get the mainstream press interested in it, especially 60 Minutes, and we'll do our part, try to get reporters interested in it. And do contact Shannon Osaka of the Washington Post. We've been talking with Michael P. Henning, a documentary producer of the classic documentary on hemp called Hempsters, Plant the Seed. How can they see that documentary before we close, Michael?
They can go to the website, hempstersthemovie.com, and see it for free.
Okay, you can't do better than that, folks. Spread the word. Let's get going. Nature is offering a solution, and corporatism is offering the devastation. That's what a democracy does. It chooses between the solution and the profit-seeking devastation. Make your candidates answer a simple question when they go back home, as they will in the next few weeks extensively in an election year. Tell them what's your policy on allowing American farmers to grow industrial hemp and to get the DEA and the Department of Agriculture off their back and stop violating direct congressional policy as of 2018, which was supposed to free the farmers to grow this wonderful long-fibered plant. Thank you very much, Michael P. Henning.
Ralph, this is very important. One last thing. The Indian reservations have the biggest chance of getting this done, and they would receive the most benefit. So anybody who has any friends or can contact any Indian reservation, they need to tell them that they have a sovereign right to grow the crop. They're like little nations inside of our country. The Native Americans could lead the way.
Good point. I'm sure Winona LaDuke has been trying to do that up in northern Minnesota as well. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
And now here's Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard.
Following President Biden's disastrous performance in the first presidential debate, pressure is beginning to build for Biden to step aside as the Democratic nominee against Trump. The Texas Tribune reports Congressman Lloyd Doggett, a Democrat representing Austin, Texas, is the first to explicitly call for Biden to stand down, writing in a statement, quote, President Biden has the opportunity to encourage a new generation of leaders from whom a nominee can be chosen to unite our country through an open democratic process. I'm hopeful that he will make the painful and difficult decision to withdraw. I respectfully call on him to do so. End quote. Other top Democrats have not gone quite so far, but haven't closed the door completely. Congressman Jim Clyburn, a powerful South Carolina Democrat and co-chair of Biden's campaign, told MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell, quote, I will support Vice President Kamala Harris if President Joe Biden were to step aside, end quote, per NBC's Gary Grumbach. NBC reports House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi said Biden's mental fitness is a, quote, legitimate question. Israel's rabidly right-wing Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has issued a statement on Twitter responding to claims from Palestinian prisoners that they face, quote, rape, physical and psychological torture, deprivation of food, medicine, and sleep, humiliation, and degradation, end quote, in Israeli prisons, per the Middle East Eye. In this statement, Ben-Gvir wrote, quote, everything published about the abominable conditions was true. I have already proposed a much simpler solution, enacting the death penalty.
Well, this has been the latest episode of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, which you can hear every Friday morning at 9 on WMNF's HD3 channel, The Source. You can hear The Source on an HD radio at 88.5 HD3, or you can hear it on WMNF.org or on the WMNF Community Radio app. This has been Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Kinane, and during this time slot tomorrow, Shelley will host Midpoint. Coming up next is Wavemakers, hosted by Janet and Tom Scherberger. Their guests today are Michelle Elena and Matt Baines. They're working to preserve and protect Egmont Key. It's a historic state park that's accessible only by boat. The key is home to a still functioning lighthouse, which was built in 1848, and to Fort Dade, which was built in 1898. It was there where Seminole Indians were held before they were sent to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. But sea level rise is slowly eroding Egmont Key, and you'll hear all about that in about 6 minutes on WMNF's Wavemakers. Coming up at noon is Wide Awake America, hosted by Nadine Smith. Today she welcomes Jason Stanley, who is a professor of philosophy at Yale University. Jason is the acclaimed author of several books, including How Propaganda Works, How Fascism Works, and his forthcoming book, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Then at 1:01, you'll hear The Scoop, which is a 5-minute summary of the day's news from the WMNF newsroom, before we get back to music with Harrison at 1:06. This has been Tuesday Cafe, coming to you from the studios of WMNF Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota, and Lakeland. Thanks so much for listening to Community Radio and for supporting listener-sponsored community radio at WMNF.org.